I wish to make a complaint.
Sorry, we're closing for lunch.
Never mind that, my lad. I wish to complain about this parrot what I purchased not half an hour ago from this very boutique.
Oh, yes, the Norwegian blue. What's wrong with it?
I'll tell you what's wrong with it. It's dead. That's what's wrong with it.
All right. So, Spencer, we just said to each other before we started recording that we thought that while the first half was fun and that we gave a nice gloss to your concerns about Proudhon, that maybe we should go into a little bit more concrete detail, which means I'm going to put off my weird questions about Mary Eddy Baker and just let you, which is what I was promising to bring up in the first half and without, in my mind anyway, which you should have known if we're all one God's mind. You should have known what I was thinking. But in any case, what do you think we should talk about to make it clearer to people who maybe watch the Cyber Dandy Ben Burgess, Doug Lane discussion, or to Ben and Cyber Dandy, that what was missed in that conversation?
Okay. So Marx makes a comment to a Proudhonian in the First International.
Uh-huh.
I think his name is Freiburg or something like this. And he says, I've already dealt with Proudhon. I dealt with him in The Poverty of Philosophy, and I've dealt with him in Capital. And he says this in 1865. And what I would say, I'll frame it in one other way. So Marx thinks that his entire critique of political economy from 1857-8, from like the Grundrisse, of course he's in the middle of writing it when he makes this comment in 1865. He hasn't published it yet, but straight through the early 1870s when he finishes writing the drafts of Volume 2 and 3, that and revising Volume 1, he thinks that whole project in some ways comes out of the poverty of philosophy. There's another sort of remark that I'd like to take up by the important New Left Marx scholar, Martin Nicolaus, who was the big inspiration for Moishe Bastone. Moishe Bastone thought that he was sort of picking up where Nicolaus left off. Nicolaus ends up becoming a Maoist sectarian. He's already a Maoist sectarian by the time he translates the Grundrisse. So he writes the introduction to the Grundrisse. It's not as good as this article he writes in 1968, I think, The Unknown Marx. And there, Nicolaus says, we have like Marxist political program on the basis of like his pre-1848 writings, but we don't have namely the Communist Manifesto, right? But we don't have anything equivalent to the manifesto on the basis of Marx's mature political economy. The closest thing we get is the critique of the Gotha program, right? And I think that in general, what he's marking there is, the way I would put it, and I think I relate it this way in my introduction to my books, where I briefly advert to the question, to the significance of Marx's thoughts on like Bonapartism and the capitalist state and democracy, how those relate to capital, right, to Marx's critique of political economy, because people generally sort of have, the political Marx over here and, the social theoretical Marx over there, and they don't speak to each other really, right? People take up different ones. So, and I already talked a little bit about like how Marx is taking up his critique of Proudhon, both from the 1844 manuscripts and the Poverty of Philosophy in the Manifesto. There's no doubt that those two texts, among others, illuminate the Manifesto and its sort of dialectical concerns. What I want to say is that so the Manifesto has this image of bourgeois society as dialectical, right? All that is solid is melting into air. All that is fixed and fast frozen, dissolves before it has time to ossify, right? It's this image of bourgeois society as freedom unleashed, right? As a constant production of the new, right?
Mhm.
Which is what freedom is, constant self-transformation. And yet it's an image of that self-transformation caught within a kind of static eternal return of the same, right? So there's a kind of a image of all the change that's taking place is constantly recreating bourgeois proletariat, this opposition, right? And so Marx is taking up how this question of class is pointing to the crisis of bourgeois society, right? To the crisis of its form of freedom. And he's not saying it's not freedom, right? He's saying that the freedom of bourgeois society is like a sorcerer's spells that have turned against him or gotten away from him, right? He has this image of like the loss of mastery, right? And I think that politically, what he's talking about there is that you can't continue the project of simply advancing the cause of labor, because the cause of labor is the project of labor, the project of value is, as we were saying in the first half, it's actually what's being expressed in the class antinomy, right? Both sides represent that, right? And so Marx is he's thinking about this. He has an image in the early period, and I think it flows into his politics in 1848. And this is where the real shift comes, is that he thinks that democracy is growing out of the political project of the working class, right? So he concludes the Poverty of Philosophy with a critique of Proudhon on trade unions and strikes, right? And Proudhon doesn't like trade unions and he doesn't like strikes, right? He doesn't like this. Marx is saying, well, these grow into politics. Like, it's out of these economic struggles that grow, like the struggle for democracy. And so in the Manifesto, he's treating the cause of communism as kind of the radical strain within democracy, right? And that is in fact how he tries to prosecute the 1848 revolution, as a kind of radical democracy. And what happens in the revolution is that the revolution is defeated by democracy, right? The Louis Bonaparte is elected on the basis of universal suffrage, right? And and by the time you get to Marx beginning to talk, the other place that Nicolaus points to, other than the critique of the Gotha program, for thinking about Marxist politics after 1848, is the inaugural address to the First International. And there Marx is saying, well, look, there's social action. There's like trade unions and cooperatives. There's like the working class building up, their institutions in society. And then there's political action. And when he's thinking about political action there, he isn't just thinking about like politics relating to the cause of labor, right? Or at least not directly. He's talking about world war, right? He's talking about the Civil War and how the U.S. Civil War, because the First International grows out of solidarity with the Union in the English Civil War. And he talks about the criminal foreign policy of the European states, because they're trying to enter the war on the side of the Confederacy. And the working class is actually going against its economic interest in trying to stop that, because the working class is being thrown out of work because there's no cotton coming from the American South. And it's a big, there are a lot of workers facing severe hardship as a result. And nevertheless, the working class of England is like, yeah, no, fuck that. We're on the side of free labor, right? Like at a political, geopolitical level, we're on the side of the Union, against the slaveocracy. And so there, Marx is talking about prosecuting political and both the political and the social struggle, right? Which in fact can come into contradiction with one another. And so he's arguing, of course, that the importance of the economic struggle isn't that it's building up socialism in society. It's not doing that, right? It's building up the capacity of the working class, and it's a school of socialism in the sense that it's a place where the working class is coming up against the limits of the project of constituting itself as commodity owners, right? Because of course its struggle is driving forward the process of the industrialization that's putting it out of work, right? It's bound up with its own contradictions, etc. So Marx is, there is a development there where Marx is really beginning to anticipate what we might call Marxism, right? Like what we think of as Marxism and like as a legacy for the Social Democratic Party, etc. Right? He's building it up throughout the First International and the writing of Capital. In Capital, what's happening is, I would say that like the critique of capitalism, and again, there are indications of this in Nicolaus's Unknown Marx. He says like, well, in the Poverty of Philosophy, like the critique of capital is like more about like it's rooted more in like the sphere of circulation, right? It's rooted in like what we would just say unemployment, right? And I think Frederick Jameson, the great Marxist literary critic, writes a book on capital, and he says, well, if you wanted to boil the book Capital down to one word, it would be unemployment, right? But really, capital's going beyond that, and of course, it's fundamentally shifting the ground of critique to production. Now, I think there are all kinds of indications that Marx is going in that direction already in The Poverty of Philosophy. But that becomes much more elaborate in capital, and it's tied up with an argument about democracy, right? So the most basic way that we would talk about democracy and Bonapartism is that capitalism is like atomizing, right? It makes us all like face this social, totality as individuals. And as individuals, we're all like little shopkeepers, right? We're all trying to kind of sell our wares. We're all like advertising ourselves, right? Here's my CV. See what a wonderful worker I am, right? Everyone's like mounting their own ad campaign, right?
Mhm.
And we're isolated from each other as individuals, and we're all in effect unemployed. In the sense that we're all threatened with unemployment, right? We're in the form, we're all threatened by the other workers in that sense, right?
Mhm.
No one can really say, nobody else can do my job, right? Like we
Mhm.
try to make ourselves indispensable, and if a young person asks me, like, how am I going to get by in life? I say, well, find something that you can do where you are indispensable, so that you're not threatened with unemployment, right? That's like, we're all
Mhm.
trying to do that. But everyone is, so it is the case that, the threat of unemployment um, is in a sense the most basic or a first approximation of Marx's critique of Marx's understanding of democracy,
Mhm.
right? So it's because we're all vulnerable, because we're all threatened with social, extinction as individuals, that we turn to the state. That we vote and we demand that the state solve this problem for us. So Marx has a wonderful image which he uses to talk about peasants in the 18th Brumaire, but it's really a description of capitalism as petty bourgeois, as isolated, where we're all like atomized, where we're all running our little sort of ad campaigns for each other, and for ourselves. And he describes it as like a sack of potatoes, right? Like workers, like as individuals, right? Just like peasants are just like, if you have 1,000 peasants, you just have 1,000 peasants, right? You don't have something more than the sum of their parts. Just like in a sack of potatoes, the question is, how many potatoes are in the sack, right? That's all that's the only question, right? It doesn't make it more by virtue of being a sack of potatoes. It's not
Mhm.
more than the sum of the potatoes. In the same, similar, he talks about the peasants in relation to Louis Bonaparte as like people praying for rain, right? That we like pray to the state to preserve us, right? Or we pray to society in through the state to preserve us, right?
Mhm.
This is also why how Marx describes modern religion, right? To go back to the religion question in God, right? What does God
Mhm.
look like in capitalism, right? He looks like a God that's willing to damn you, right? Or to save you in a way that is ultimately inexplicable, right?
Have
Right.
you? I'm
So,
gonna. I'm gonna. I'm
so
gonna
you're
interrupt as a
you're
dumb aside. Just one second, and I'll get to. We can go back to the state. But have you seen like Heaven Can Wait, or there's even a movie called with Benji
your
in it.
references are your references are more dated. They're too dated even for me, Doug.
Oh man, it's like the 70s,
Heaven,
man. So
heaven can wait. Okay.
well, in it,
What are you telling me?
well,
How did
the
it come up?
heaven is a big bureaucracy. It's a big state bureaucracy. in these movies again and again when heaven is depicted in Hollywood movies. It's a bureaucracy, and you go and you see a guy with like a little visor, and he has a machine to tell you if you're going to get into heaven or not. That's how it is in Oh Heavenly Dog with Chevy Chase and Benji. He dies and goes to heaven, and there's a guy with a visor and a machine. But over and over again.
Right.
Anyway, just came to
Right,
mind.
because
Sorry.
maybe government work. Maybe government work is like the most stable job you can get. Right.
Right. That's true. But also, you're praying to the state to preserve you. Right. The heaven, God is up there in the big state bureaucracy. Kafka.
Right. So the third image. Oh yeah.
Go ahead.
Right. Oh, no doubt. Right.
Right.
Kafka is obviously like this incredible literary, reflection on capitalist society.
Right.
The other image that Marx has is of Louis Bonaparte as a thief, right? As a criminal, of course, because there's a lawlessness at the heart of the capitalist state. It's in a permanent state of exception, where Louis Bonaparte steals all of France in order to give it back as his gift, right? Which is a really fantastic image of like why the turn to democracy, right? Our social problems, we think, can only be addressed by the state, right? And it's like and it is like making yourself worthy of being saved, right? There is a religious dimension to that, right? That which Marx is getting at, like the dynamics of mass conformity, of like massification in democracy. How are we going to differentiate ourselves from each other? Well, not really by skill, because we're living in an industrial society and we are totally replaceable one with another. But I can conform more than you do, right? I can demonstrate, that I'm going to be a good boy, if you favor me. And of course, this is an image. This is why socialists hate welfare, right? Because that's exactly what it turns the working class into, like the abject clients of society in the form of the state, and of capitalism in the form of the capitalist state. It's a gift, that we better behave, right? And the social worker might come to the house and don't engage, don't smoke pot, and don't do this and don't do that. Right? There are all the rules that are sort of legal and sort of not. So Marx is getting at democracy in capital in a profounder way, because he's talking about the way that the sphere of production is the crisis of, it's precisely in our attempt to constitute ourselves as workers, right? It's precisely in our struggle as the socialist working class. He gives the example of the 10 hours bill, right? Which is obviously a political reform that was instituted by the capitalist political parties to address the social question, because the workers were organized. The Tories passed that bill to dish the Whigs, as they would say. It's a little anachronistic, but that's the idea. And the 10 hours bill is what's propelling the problem of relative surplus value, right, for Marx, right? It's what it's the case that he gives of the struggle over the length of the working day is what's propelling the capitalist to shorten the portion, to shorten the amount of time that it takes to produce any given good, right? And in that sense, ultimately, to drive down the value of labor, right, and increase.
Was that the only reason that capitalists would shorten the amount of time it took to create a commodity?
Ultimately, yes.
wasn't to compete with other capitalists to gain super profits. That was also mentioned, I think.
That's of course a phenomenal form of like the capitalist motivation, right? For sure. Right. That there's a period of time when they are the only ones who are producing things super efficiently. All their competitors are merely producing things efficiently. Marx has lots of funny ways of referring to it. The springtime of our first love, right, and whatever, right, all of that, right, where you're making 20 coats in the time that it takes all the other capitalists to make 10, and so
But you're
you
charging the
can,
same as they are.
or
And
you can just slightly undercut them,
right, undercut them a little bit. Right.
right, and still make super profits and drive all your competitors out, right, all whatever.
Mhm.
But at a total social level,
Mhm.
right, capital is driven, and of course there's a political dimension to this, which we have all kinds of super fetishized ways of talking about, like
Mhm.
Trump's going to bring jobs back to America, right, right, which is a very crude and obviously inadequate way of talking about the political imperative that that's being mediated through the state of putting people to work, right? Because what we need capital to do is to put us to work, right? Not just produce cheap things for us to buy, right?
Right.
Obviously, the Democrats are like, well, we can give you a UBI and you can go to Walmart and buy like super cheap goods, and like that solves the social question,
But
right?
that
It
doesn't,
does
because
not.
even the capitalists will not, that won't work out for them ultimately either, let alone the workers.
It won't
Right.
work out for them. It's not obviously a viable economic project. It's also a complete gutting of the promise of bourgeois society, right?
Right.
Because it means that workers can in no way um, engage in bourgeois freedom, right? They can't get jobs and move out of their neighborhoods and meet new people and develop their skills and build a career and all of the things that we look to from work.
Right.
um
It's socially deadening, and because they can't go into work and participate in changing society through productive work, and it's politically deadening too because they won't have any leverage as welfare UBI recipients, right?
right, so the flip side of the degraded Democrat form of talking about this is the Republican form of talking about it, where they'll say no, people want jobs, they want the dignity of labor, right, which is like bourgeois,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's very bourgeois. But the question is like, well,
Hold on one
you
second.
know,
Sorry.
sure, I'm,
Okay.
the problem with capitalism is that it can't provide labor for the whole world, right? Obviously, it can't.
Right.
It can't harness the ability and the capacity of the individuals that it's producing to staff it, right? Most of what it produces these people to kind of wait in the wings as reserve army of labor, right? Or candidates for the reserve army of labor, right? It produces overpopulation, as Marx talks about, right? Uh, for the sake of its future expansion, right? But it can't plan how many workers it's going to need any more than it can plan, how many hats should be produced. Um, it might overproduce the people, in which case, some of them are going to have to get remaindered, or whatever. Um, so
Right. And the Republican Party explanation for that is, well, some people are lazy, some people are no good, so those people are the ones that don't want the dignity of work, like the
right, because they've
that.
internal. I mean, there's a truth to that, of course, right?
Mhm.
There are the irredeemably lumpen elements in society, who
Mhm.
have fully internalized that they are discarded, right?
Right.
And this, of course, generates like a romanticism of criminality, right? A romanticism of that we look to like mental illness and criminals as like the critics of society. It's romanticized often, but they are symptoms of the failure of society for sure,
Mhm.
right? But what I'm trying to emphasize is that for Marx, the state is an expression of the crisis of society, right? The state isn't just like a power grab,
Mhm.
right? The state is fulfilling a need that in the absence of the dictatorship of the proletariat, in the absence of the working class managing in the sense of coming to grips with the crisis of society politically by holding state power and staffing the state, right? Eliminating the bureaucracy and putting workers, or the organized working class into the state, substituting their bodies of armed men for ours. Um, in the absence of that, the state is necessary, and the democratic form is the most adequate form to that necessary management of the crisis of society. Now, this is why Louis Bonaparte is a Democrat. Bismarck is a Democrat, right? Bismarck will grant universal suffrage, right? And
And again, to go back to Proudhon, Marx thinks that you have to, just like you have to go through the steam press, you have to go through the state in order to realize socialism or to overcome the contradictions in society. You don't
you
want
have
to,
to win the battle of democracy,
yeah.
right? And so you know, Proudhon is great as like a critic of democracy, right? His book on the Revolution of 1848 is, like I mentioned before, it's called The General Idea of the Revolution in the 19th Century. And I include a review of it in my book.
Mhm.
In my
Yeah,
book.
there you go.
It's the only thing that I include that's not written by Marx or Engels. It's written by a worker intellectual named Gerd Icarius, who is part of the Marx circle or party in the 1850s, and he ends up being really important in the First International and eventually breaking with Marx. But his review is like obviously coming out of Marx's parlor. He's obviously hanging out with Marx, and they're talking about these books that have been written about 1848. Marx like just flags it in his preface to the second edition of the 18th Brumaire, where he says, Victor Hugo thinks that the coming of Louis Bonaparte is like a bolt from the blue, and Proudhon thinks it's an expression of historical necessity. That for neither one of them can, how does he put it, explain the conditions of possibility of, basically how a clown could play a hero's part. I forget Marx's exact language, but what are the actual conditions of possibility for Louis Bonaparte as an actual expression of regression and the return of the state? But Proudhon in that book, just slams the Democrats, like slams the people who think that the point of the revolution is democracy, right? Because of course the revolution institutes universal suffrage democracy. Icarius calls him the Mephistopheles of democracy, right? That he's showing all the wicked, evil underbelly of democracy. and Marx counterposes him to Blanqui, who also is developing, who's the leader of the French proletariat. Who, if Marx says like I'm on the side of the proletariat, what he means is like Blanquist French working class, right? That's what he means in 1848. And Blanqui also is beginning to develop this critique. In the Paris Commune writings, Marx will talk about how Blanquists become like Proudhonists, and Proudhonists become like Blanquists, and they're ultimately synthesizing in the necessity of Marxism, in the necessity of like the dictatorship of the proletariat. So Marx claims the Paris Commune, even though there's no Marxist in it, right? So he's playing on this, the way that both the political left, Blanqui, who is trying to seize power, and Proudhon, who's the anti-political left, are both recognizing from different directions the crisis that is democracy brought on by the revolution, right? But the problem is that he's not trying to work through the phenomena. He's not trying to work through the material of history. It'd be another way of thinking about like Marx's understanding, like materialism, right? You have to work like immanent to these symptomatic forms, right? Yes, there's a critique of democracy. How do you prosecute it? By creating a party in democracy, right? That's going to politically prosecute the crisis of democracy, right? That's what socialist politics is intending to do. So I would say that, in this sense, like Marx is carrying on the critique of anarchism from the pre-1848 writings in a very profound way through his post-1848 writings, not just in the explicit instances that I have edited and that are well known beyond what I've edited. What I've edited is all about Marx on Bonapartism or imperialism, interchangeable words. And obviously, the Civil War in France, the Paris Commune book, is all about Bonapartism and the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It grows out of the 18th Brumaire, but also the critique of political economy, right? That Marx is saying there that your attempt to build up a society of bourgeois property owners is what's going on in the trade union struggle and the strike struggle that you're rejecting, right? Those are workers trying to claim ownership of their labor power. And in a deeper sense, how is the working class demanding industrialization, right? They're demanding it in the kind of a politically mediated way by talking about, by shortening the length of the working day. But in a profounder sense, they're demanding it because they're constantly demanding more and more unskilled labor, right? Like, we want any job. We will do anything, right? I can flip burgers at McDonald's and I can, make cappuccino, and I can go to work in the factory and I can mow lawns, all in order to pay for my college that's going to make me a teacher or this, and then I'm going to quit being a teacher because of the burnout and, they're asking too much of me. And then I'm going to, become your portfolio advisor, right? Whatever it is, right? We are demanding to be labor as like in the fully realized sense of that concept, right? That the industrial revolution, that capital, that the ongoing technological transformation of society is making it more, is realizing the commodity form of labor in reality, right? Even as it's creating this capital accumulation dynamic that I know you have thought a lot about,
Yeah.
rooted in the organic composition of capital, et cetera, right? Which is expressed as a, where the self-contradiction of this freedom is expressed as crisis and breakdown, right?
Well,
Right.
I want to ask you. I want to ask you a question. Go ahead.
Just the utopian possibility is to master and prosecute the breakdown of capitalism, right? To make the crisis a total disintegration, right? In that sense, to prosecute the negativity in capital to the point of the self-abolition of the proletariat itself.
Yeah, but to do that, you
Right.
can't just hope that everything falls apart. But
No,
rather,
you cannot. You have to. You have to achieve the dictatorship of the proletariat, right?
Yeah.
Where the people themselves in society can address the self-contradiction of bourgeois right in the context of a coercive state that's managing that self-contradiction, but is nevertheless working class, right? That is manned by workers, that is, of course, subject to the recall by workers, right? So that, maybe you have to break strikes.
Right? And that would have to be profoundly democratic, wouldn't it? I mean, you'd have to have a mass participation in that process of the work.
Well, it wouldn't just be profoundly democratic. I mean, it would have, it would have, of course, coercive elements. Like you could imagine the dictatorship of the proletariat breaking a strike,
right?
For instance, but more importantly, it would allow not only, it wouldn't just be like democratic. It would allow for the prosecution of the task of democracy, which is the addressing of the.
Your microphone went out for a second. I can hear you now. Yeah.
Sorry, that was Chris calling. He, I guess, thinks that I've gotten off by now.
Well, we're almost done.
Yeah, what it's opening up is that you're prosecuting the task of democracy in the sense that you're addressing what produced democracy. You're addressing the self-contradiction of bourgeois freedom that is the reason for democracy itself. Right? That's the thing.
I want to ask you a question. It's kind of big.
Right. That's why socialism is beyond democracy. Right? Because when you are fully democratic, what you are doing is overcoming the necessity of democracy, and of course overcoming the necessity of any state. And you are creating a society that is self-regulating, in which there is anarchy.
Okay, so I'm going to think about all those things after we're done, because I feel like I understand you, but maybe on too surface a level. So I'm going to think about it again later. But before I do that, before we wrap it up, I want to ask you about, what was the name of Moise Pastone's teacher that he was picking up?
He wasn't a teacher. He was just he was a new leftist named Martin Nicolaus. He's probably
Nicolaus. So he was a writer. Yeah,
he was a writer.
Yeah,
he wrote this essay in the New Left Review in 1968, which is obviously a big organ of the New Left at that time, and it's all about the Grundrisse, right?
How did he go from that to becoming a Maoist? What was it about the problems that Marxism faced in 68 or in the middle of the 20th century that led so many American leftists, and I think European leftists as well, to turn to Maoism as a way to proceed forward to what I mean, because I think of that as an error,
Right. Myself. I mean, I guess at the most basic, so what does Nicolaus write? He writes
what kind of Maoist
the
was
unknown Marx and other things in the 60s that are really interesting in terms of like this very interesting question of like, why does Marx return in history? Right? Marx returns in the 1960s to do what? To criticize socialism. Right? That's what Marx is. That's what Marx is good for. Right? Marx is good for criticizing socialism. And what did that look like in the 20th century? Criticizing, of course, social democracy, or what we might call the West, or the global, or the New Deal order, and the East, right? Communism. Now, Maoism was an argument, for these people about how the Soviet Union, and in that sense, Stalinism, had become capitalist, right? So that Marx allows us to criticize the Soviet Union or Stalinism. Now, there's in other words, like there's a Trotskyists will make the same gesture, like we're going to make a Marxist critique of Stalinism, right? But the Maoists are making the same gesture, right? You could say that in part they're sort of stealing the Trotskyists' thunder. They're treating Stalinism, or they're treating the Soviet Union as revisionist, right? That's the original impulse. That's what Mao says, right, about Khrushchev, right? The peaceful competition with the West that Khrushchev is arguing for, which is kind of a pacification of the conflict with the West. He's saying that's a retreat from the revolution into revisionism, right? So by 1975, what Nikolaus is doing is he's giving he writes a book called The Restoration of Capitalism in the Soviet Union. I would say that Moish is, there's similarities with Moish, right? Because Moish wants to explain how you can have an industrial society without private property, right? How can you have a capitalist society, like a developed society, that you can nevertheless criticize as capitalist, even though they've abolished private property?
Right. I mean, I come out of the Marxist Humanist Initiative, or went through that period, and they also critiqued the Soviet Union as capitalist, without and
it's the whole new left criticizes the Soviet Union, right? Obviously,
right. Yeah. On that grounds, on the grounds using like state capitalism as a part of their critique, and saying, what is important is not the legal designation of private property, but rather the social relationship around production. I think
right, exactly. So when you get down into the underlying significance of the categories of Marxist critique of political economy, of course, Marx understands that this is not a society of private property, right? He knows that out of competition is growing monopoly and state capitalism, and that the Bonapartist state is profoundly involved in the reproduction of capital, right? All of these, so Marx's categories can be used, of course, to criticize state capitalism, because state capitalism is just capitalism for Marx, right? The state is emerging out of the crisis of the economy, and it's managing the crisis of the economy, right? It's not some self-regulating system of private property, right? It's not bourgeois society, right? It's capitalist, right? And that means that the state is like suffusing society, right? The way Marx describes it, it's clogging the pores of society, right? It's emerging out of society, and yet it's constraining society, right? So people like Nikolaus and Proudhon and the Marxist humanists are fulfilling the new left's desire to, neither Washington nor Moscow, right? Like, we're going to criticize all of it as capitalist, and that's what, and sort of within that you get kind of Trotskyist and Maoist flavors of that.
Yeah, but I
Yeah,
mean, I
would
just think
say
that the critique of
yeah.
Stalinist Russia or the Soviet Union would roughly, especially from the humanist position, would roughly apply to Maoist China as well. But so that just different
Right.
critiques.
And that's where they would talk about the revolution within the revolution,
Mm-hmm.
right? That sort of thing. Moish,
Right.
would be, less concerned. Moish didn't join a Maoist sect.
Mm-hmm.
All that I'm saying is that, the um, he preserves a lot of the Stalinist preoccupations. So let me be clear for listeners. When I
Yeah.
say
And
Stalinist
for me.
preoccupations, right? For me, Maoism is a way of preserving Stalinism through anti-Stalinism, right?
Okay.
So what is Mao's critique of Khrushchev? His critique of Khrushchev is that Khrushchev is abandoning the revolutionary legacy of Stalin, right? That is
Mm-hmm.
Mao's argument, right? So the question is, not just like the state of the society, but what is its political trajectory, right? And for a real Maoist like Nikolaus, that question is opened up by the death of Mao and the defeat of the Gang of Four, where it's like clearly a right wing turn, which is being stacked on top of course, the very inconvenient fact that China's become an ally of the United States after Nixon's trip.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why someone like Martin Nikolaus, if you will, as an honest leftist, drops out of the left and becomes an alcoholic, which is what it ends up founding like an atheist form of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's what happened to Martin Nikolaus. Um, in a similar way, the living issues of the 60s and 70s are kind of dying in the academic expression that Moish perforce makes peace with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where he's obviously prosecuting arguments of the 60s and 70s in the 80s and 90s, which is why in some ways I like Moish's writings from the 70s better than I like Time, Labor, and Social Domination, because obviously that's a great book, but it's given this kind of this is like social theory academic. It has to be. That's the book he gets tenure on, or fails to
Mm-hmm.
get tenure on, as it happened, because Chicago sociology denied him tenure.
Oh, really? I didn't
Yeah,
know that.
yeah, that's why he ended up in the history department, because basically he was just saved by his friends as a refugee, but he had no.
He did
It's
get
not.
tenure in the history department then? Is
He
that
he did, but he was no kind of historian. It was just there were more leftists in the history department than there were in the sociology department, and they weren't going to let him go. And
Mhm.
anyway, his main job was teaching undergraduates in the college. He could do that without reference to expertise. Um, so that's what I would say is that we are looking at these are American or Anglophone versions of a massive worldwide phenomenon, uh, which is the new left's reappropriation of Marx, right? And one of the things that I would say about like this podcast, or like thinking about this history,
Mhm.
is that the millennial left like didn't really take like they had an undoubted confrontation with like the political task of their time, in a way that as you've talked about with Chris many times in discussing his book, our generation did not. I'm, for instance, editing the Platypus Review Reader Volume 2 right now, and I make the argument in the introduction that the party question, the necessity of like a socialist party, actually appears to as a task to the millennials. in fragments and shards and through a glass darkly, and ultimately they evade it by the DSA Democrat turn in America. But what the millennials didn't really do is attempt to work through the fractured and intractable legacy of socialism and Marxism. And we're kind of seeing the consequence of that. In many ways, they disintegrated that legacy because they've undone like the sectarian legacy. Right, the sects have been largely destroyed because the millennials didn't join them, and that means like a history, a memory has been lost that was institutionalized in those sects in however ossified a way, and you get these people, quite frankly, like Ben Burgess talking about G.A. Cohen as if this was anything other than the most degenerate reading of Marx that is utterly undialectical and reproduces every opposition between like the normative and the moral versus the scientific, and just a total hash of Marxism, in good faith, because they didn't need to work through it, right? And so I would say that when we're trying to reappropriate Marx and we're trying to think through him, you're right to look to people like Kleiman or Postone, or to be interested in who is this Nicolaus fellow, because like all of the fancy Neue Marx lectura and value, new Marx reading and value theoretical Germans, etc., or one of my favorite writers, Hal Draper. We can only get to it through what the itself highly imperfect and misleading legacy of the New Left, right? So like that's why like I would make a critique of some of my dear friend and sorely missed Professor Moish Postone, right? I learned an immense amount from him, right? But I had to work through him in order to, as best as I could, confront what I take to be the crisis of this project in the present. Right? You have to like have a very self-aware attempt at like overcoming the failure of the New Left in working through, as you inevitably must, its bequeathal of this material to us. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does.
They all do it, right? Like Sartre's doing it. They're all doing it in the 60s. Back to Marx. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. I've noticed lately again that people who are part of the Marxist left will, it seems to me, abuse quotations from Marx, or whole conceptual categories. And one of the things that I try to do when I encounter a quotation now is just to contextualize it, because I'm not going to know right off the bat. Like I know that, for instance, the quote that was put before me by the patron was not one that I knew. I could tell what it meant from the little segment of it. It just, I could tell the kind of the affect of it, the tone, but I couldn't tell I didn't even know what he was talking about. Right. So I had to go and look at the actual original text and read through it and go, okay, this is what he's referring to. And I wonder if is one of the advantages of the Gen Xers that we know that we don't know things, that we're a little bit more aware of our limitations. Do you think? I mean,
I would say, if I think about my role in Platypus, I think that Gen X knew that the attempt to reproduce new leftism in the 80s and 90s was a misfire. That for, like, you could say our generation didn't rise to the task or whatever, right? But it just didn't work. And you can see that in the fact that, like, none of the sects that came out of the New Left are led by Gen Xers, right? It's got to be Bob Avakian, right? Or, whomever. It's got to be somebody from the 60s, right? Like our whole lives. And then it just melted down. And so what we could tell the millennials is, like, that project that you're being recruited to, right? You're trying to rerun the civil rights movement. You're trying to rerun the anti-war movement. You're trying to rerun you're trying to rerun the rank and file strategy. You're rerunning the New Left. But it's a really important thing to remember. It failed. Like, like you're repeating a failure, right? If you're, perhaps we're bound to repeat, but we got to think about how we can repeat in a way that produces at least a productive defeat. That can generate the possibility of building something new and breaking this cycle of repetition. And that's where, like, going back to the 19th century. I mean, I think that these books they just don't mean anything. Like, we don't have the literate capacity to read this stuff unless you really, first of all, you've got to let yourself be taught, right? If you don't let yourself be taught, you can't learn. Autodidacticism is fine, but you got to let yourself. And when you are,
I can hear you.
Crap.
What?
Phone call coming.
I can. Okay. I can.
What
still hear you.
like, so reading Capital, right? Like, how do you understand that when Marx is talking about all of these political economists from the 17th and 18th centuries, right, that criticizing socialism?
Right. Well, I mean, I did have the luck. I did have the luck to go through an old sect, right, for a good part later in my life than most. But so that was helpful, and also
it is helpful.
Yeah. Also doing a podcast for as long as I have and talking to a lot of different intellectuals about these topics was an education. It was an autodidactic one, but I was learning as I went through, and I think that millennials and Zoomers can get an education, even in a mixed one, but they can't do it by only consuming like this channel, for instance. Like it will help, but then you need to go and start your own projects, do your own reading groups, find people to work with in real life and things like that.
I mean, if we're talking to, like, young intellectuals, right, people who really want to understand this stuff, like Doug does, or like Chris Catrone does, or maybe like Spencer does. You gotta you actually have to pursue study, right? And like, Marx doesn't mean anything, and Marxism doesn't mean so what I've been trying to do with this Proudhon and Marx discussion is to explain that what Marx is talking about is a profound, imminent engagement with all of these positions, with these movements in real history, right? Like, most people just don't think about, like, how is capital an argument against anarchism? In fact, you'll get anarchists who say they love capital. Marx is really good on the economy. It's like he's explaining the impossibility of anarchist politics, right? He's telling you why the state exists, right? That it is something that has to be worked through, right? But people don't, you kind of have to reconstruct it, from the debates, right? Rather than just, like, mastering the concepts. Otherwise, the concepts are kind of, like, unmotivated, right? You don't like, why is he doing this? Right? Why is he putting it this way? You know,
Mhm.
why is he logically deriving money from the commodity form and telling me that X equals Y is not the same as Y equals X? You know, that one coat equals 20 yards of linen is not an equivalent expression to 20 yards of linen equals one coat, which defies all logic, right?
Right.
All conventional logic, right? What's he doing?
But
Right? What's
that
he
that makes
signaling?
sense though in the context of capital because of
It
the
makes
relationship.
sense, right? You know, and why does he end after talking about money with like the fetishism of commodities, right? Right? And it's like it really, you know, it is because we're talking of, you know, as he says in the Critique of Proudhon, money's a social relation,
Right.
right? You know, Proudhon's just like, well, money is like what every product should be. Like money's the commodity that automatically exchanges. And what we need is for the product of everybody's labor to automatically exchange with everybody else's.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And Marx is like, can we think about what money is? Right.
Right.
Like,
Right.
and why, like, it's not even like a commodity, right? Because you can replace the commodity with paper, right? That has no value, right? As like, you know, or certainly like the production cost of $100 bill is not 100 times the production cost of a $1 bill. What are we, right? What are we talking about here?
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
that, you know, that money is like a profound fetish object, right?
Yeah. Mm.
Right? Right? It's masking, right? It's how we're operating in the society, but underlying it are all these dynamics that are utterly opaque to us. And by the way, you're not going to get there through your simple logic. You're not going to get there through the logic of like debate, right? Of Aristotle, of like identifying the logical fallacies, right? You're
Right.
going to get at it by understanding this society as a dialectics,
Right. Well, listen, this is the
including in the real, in, you know, as it were, in the material world. Yeah, go ahead.
final question for you, and then I'll let you go, which is you said that the Gen X didn't lead up any of these sectarian groups or any of these organizations. You know, they were all boomers,
Except
but
one.
the Platypus Affiliate Society is led by
Yeah.
Gen Xers. And sublation is not the same thing, but sublation, I'm a Gen Xer. That's a Gen X project. Do you think that maybe now is the Gen X moment? Now that we're old and decrepit, we could be the new boomers trying to
I mean,
set the
obviously, you know, obviously we have to be, you know, in a sense, what I was saying before, you know, we have to be better than the boomers, in the sense that, you know, what are the boomers to us, right? The boomers to us are teachers, right? The boomers
Mhm,
to us are elders. Um,
mhm.
you know, and we have an obligation to teach young people, right? We're not going to be, you know, we're not going to experience social crisis and renewed leftist politics as young people, right? Um, you know, we're not. Obviously, there's something to that. There's something to Marx experiencing the 1840s, the hungry 40s, the crisis of capital, the first real industrial crisis as a young man, right? There's a relationship between what generation he and Proudhon are and what that debate is about. Right? Um, we have to be there to say, you know, okay, go beyond me,
Mhm,
but go beyond me by working through what I'm teaching you,
mhm.
right? Rather than a kind, you know, and of course, then that summons us, you know, to be teachers worthy of that, right? I don't think, you know, obviously, you know, platypus is sect-like in that, you know, we have like a take on the on history,
Mhm.
um, we're not sect-like in that we're not a party imposing party discipline, and we don't have like a line, even though no one understands that. I know that they think that we have a line. There's no line. You can think whatever you want to about Israel, Palestine, or any other fucking thing, and be a member of Platypus. It's not. There's no political line. But I do think that to get back to the millennials,
they're not going to experience it as young people either.
They're not going to experience it as young people either, and they've deluded themselves. They were profoundly anti-sectarian, which there was some deep rationality to that because they saw the ossification, the lack of vitality in the sectarian left. And they really thought about, they were really, they read the microsect essay. They really thought about these things, right? Politics. But what they joined was kind of a, kind of right-wing social democratic, Cold War Marxist sect, right? The DSA. And now the necessity of sectarianism, given the death of the left, is reproducing itself as caucuses within the DSA, as like the debates within the DSA. Mm-hmm. And those debates are more opaque by virtue of passing through this kind of it's an anti-sectarian sectarianism. Mm-hmm. Right. And that passage threatens to simply be confusing. Right, where people are making kind of, they're losing the coherence of the arguments of the past, and they're just reproducing them in even more fragmentary ways.
All right, well, Spencer, you'll have to come back again, and we'll talk about your books next time if you are willing. And I really enjoyed both parts of this conversation today. So thanks for coming on.
It's always nice to talk.